Margaret Eleanor Whitmore had always believed that love, when given freely and without condition, would one day find its way back to her. For 72 years, she had lived by that quiet philosophy, pouring herself into the lives of others, first as a devoted wife, then as a tireless mother, and eventually as the kind of grandmother who remembered birthdays without reminders and baked pies that carried the warmth of generations. Yet on a gray November morning, as she stood in the center of her own living room watching her son and daughter-in-law pack her belongings into cardboard boxes, Margaret felt something inside her shift in a way she had never experienced before. Not anger, not even sadness, but a cold, awakening clarity. "Mom, this is for your own good," her son Daniel said, barely looking at her as he folded one of her sweaters with careless haste. "You can't keep living alone like this. It's not safe anymore." Margaret nodded slowly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture still upright despite her age. "I see," she replied softly. Claire, Daniel's wife, chimed in from across the room, her tone coated in a practiced sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. "The place we found is lovely, Margaret. It's called Silver Pines Care Residence. Very reputable. You'll have nurses, activities, people your own age. You won't be lonely anymore." Lonely, the word echoed faintly in Margaret's mind, almost amusing in its irony. She had never felt as alone as she did standing in that room filled with people who were supposed to be her family. "I wasn't aware I had complained about loneliness," Margaret said calmly. Daniel sighed, clearly impatient. "Mom, don't make this difficult. We've already put down the deposit. Everything is arranged. You'll be moving today." Today. So that was it. No discussion, no time, no dignity in the decision. Margaret glanced around the house she had lived in for 43 years. The walls that had held laughter, arguments, Christmas mornings, and quiet evenings with her late husband, Edward. Every corner of that home carried a memory, and now those memories were being reduced to boxes labeled in black marker. She said nothing more, because Margaret Whitmore had learned something very important in life. When people underestimate you, they often reveal far more than they realize. The drive to Silver Pines was quiet. Daniel focused on the road, his jaw tight, while Claire scrolled through her phone in the passenger seat. Margaret sat in the back, her small suitcase beside her, her gaze fixed on the passing trees. "Once you're settled," Claire said without turning around, "we'll come visit on weekends, right, Daniel?" "Yeah," he muttered, "of course." Margaret didn't respond. She had heard promises like that before. Silver Pines Care Residence stood at the edge of the city, surrounded by manicured lawns and tall oak trees. From the outside it looked peaceful, almost elegant, a place designed to reassure families that they had made the right decision. As they pulled into the driveway, Margaret allowed herself a small, almost invisible smile. "Here we are," Daniel said, parking the car. "Not so bad, right?" Margaret opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the gravel path. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. "No," she said quietly, "not bad at all." Inside, the building smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. A receptionist greeted them with a professional smile, handing over forms and directing them to a nurse who would assist with Margaret's intake. As Daniel signed papers, barely reading them, Margaret's eyes wandered across the lobby, taking in every detail, every corner, every face. Nothing escaped her notice. Because what Daniel and Claire didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask, never cared enough to discover, was that Margaret Whitmore was not the fragile, dependent old woman they believed her to be. Not even close. 7 years earlier, after Edward's passing, Margaret had found herself alone for the first time in decades. The silence had been unbearable at first, pressing in on her from all sides. But instead of collapsing under it, she had done something unexpected. She had built something. Quietly, carefully, without telling anyone. With the inheritance Edward left behind and a lifetime of savings, Margaret had begun investing in real estate. Not flashy properties, not risky ventures, solid, steady investments. One of those investments had been Silver Pines Care Residence. At first, it was just another opportunity, an aging facility in need of renovation, overlooked by bigger investors. But Margaret saw potential where others saw decline. She purchased it through a holding company, financed the renovations, hired new management, and transformed it into one of the most respected care homes in the region. And she had done it all without telling her son. Because Daniel had never asked. "Mrs. Whitmore," a nurse said, interrupting her thoughts, "we're ready for you." Margaret smiled politely, "Of course." Daniel gave her a quick hug, awkward, rushed. "You'll be fine, Mom. This is the best place for you." Claire added, "We'll visit soon, okay?" Margaret looked at them both, her expression calm, unreadable. "I'm sure you will," she said. And then she turned and walked away. The first few days passed quietly. Margaret settled into her room, unpacking her belongings with deliberate care. She attended meals, observed the routines, spoke kindly with other residents. To anyone watching, she was just another elderly woman adjusting to life in a care facility. But beneath that calm exterior, something else was unfolding. Margaret was watching, listening, learning, and waiting. It didn't take long for her to notice the cracks. Small things at first: staff cutting corners, management making questionable decisions, residents being treated with polite indifference rather than genuine care. Silver Pines had changed since she last reviewed its operations. And not for the better. Margaret said nothing. Not yet. Meanwhile, Daniel and Claire wasted no time. Within a week of Margaret's move, they listed her house for sale. Prime location, the real estate agent said during the open house. We'll get a great price for this. Claire smiled, already imagining the upgrades they would make to their own home. Daniel nodded, calculating numbers in his head. They didn't feel guilty. Not really. After all, they told themselves it was practical, necessary, logical. Margaret didn't need the house anymore. And they did. Back at Silver Pines, Margaret sat in the garden one afternoon, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. A man approached her, tall, in his 50s, wearing a tailored suit. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully. Margaret looked up, her eyes sharp despite her gentle demeanor. "Mr. Harris," she replied. The facility manager shifted slightly, lowering his voice. "We didn't expect you to move in." Margaret smiled faintly. Life is full of surprises. He hesitated. "Should we inform the board?" "No," Margaret said calmly, "not yet." There was a pause. "And the current operations?" he asked carefully. Margaret's gaze drifted back to the residents walking along the garden paths. "We will discuss that soon," she said, "very soon." 2 weeks later, Daniel received a letter. Official, formal, unexpected. He frowned as he opened it, scanning the contents. "What is it?" Claire asked. Daniel's face went pale. "It's from Silver Pines," he said slowly. Claire frowned. Why would they? He looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want us to come in for a meeting." The conference room was quiet when Daniel and Claire arrived. Mr. Harris sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. And beside him, Margaret, sitting tall, composed, in control. "Mom," Daniel said, confused, "what are you doing here?" Margaret folded her hands neatly on the table. "I believe," she said calmly, "it's time we had a conversation." Claire laughed nervously. "What is this, some kind of joke?" Margaret didn't smile. "No," she said, "not a joke." She slid a folder across the table. Daniel opened it. Inside were documents, contracts, ownership records. His hands began to tremble. "What is this?" he whispered. Margaret met his gaze. "This," she said, her voice steady, "is proof that I own this facility." Silence. Complete, crushing silence. Claire's face drained of color. That's impossible." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Is it?" she asked. Daniel stared at the papers, his world unraveling line by line. You own Silver Pines," he stammered. "Yes." "For how long?" "7 years." Claire shook her head, backing away slightly. No, this doesn't make any sense." Margaret leaned forward just slightly, her presence suddenly commanding. "You placed me here," she said quietly, believing I was a burden, an inconvenience, something to be managed. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You sold my home," Margaret continued, "without once asking me what I wanted." "We thought," he started. "You didn't think," she interrupted gently. "That's the problem." The room felt smaller, heavier. "I gave you everything," Margaret said, not with anger but with truth. "My time, my love, my life. And in return, you gave me a one-way ticket out of my own home." Tears filled Claire's eyes. "We didn't mean." Margaret raised a hand. "I'm not interested in intentions," she said, "only actions." Daniel's voice cracked. "Mom, what do you want?" Margaret sat back, her expression softening just slightly, but her eyes remained firm. "What I want," she said, "is very simple." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I want respect." Silent. "And until you understand what that truly means," she added, "you will not receive anything from me. Not money, not property, not support." Claire wiped her tears. Are you cutting us off?" Margaret looked at her calmly. "No," she said. "I'm setting boundaries." Daniel sank into his chair, the reality crashing down on him. For the first time in his life, he saw his mother not as someone fragile, but as someone powerful, someone he had completely underestimated. "Mom," he whispered, Margaret stood, straight, strong, unshaken. I am not a burden, she said quietly. I am the foundation you stood on. She turned toward the door, then paused. And from now on, she added without looking back, you will learn to stand on your own. And with that, Margaret Whitmore walked out of the room, not as a forgotten mother, but as a woman who had finally reclaimed her life.